Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 13 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. I had such a useful and fascinating discussion with Dr. Lisa Damour for this episode. Lisa is a clinical psychologist and is the New York Times bestselling author of Untangled, Guiding Teenage Girls Through the 7 Transitions into Adulthood, and the brand new Under Pressure, Confronting the Epidemic of Stress and Anxiety in Girls. I'm very glad to bring you my discussion with Lisa for this episode. One of the questions I hear a lot is, how do I know if something is a grief issue or a normal teenage issue? I figured since she's an expert in teenage girls, who better to help us understand our daughters and to help us understand what normal looks like. And then when we have a better grasp on what's normal, we can also better understand when we should maybe potentially be concerned. Lisa and I talked about a wide range of topics. The 7 developmental tasks that teenagers are working on, parting with childhood, including what this looks like and when to be concerned, joining a new tribe, including why having 1 or 2 close friends at this age is actually preferable to having a large circle of friends, harnessing emotions, including how teenagers' brains undergo a massive upgrade beginning with the emotion centers, why parents need to be strong enough to withstand their teenager pushing away, and why this is complicated by bereavement, serving as the emotional dumping ground for your teenager, and how stress and anxiety are normal and healthy functions for all people, teenagers included. I hope you enjoy my discussion with Dr. Lisa Damour. My guest today is clinical psychologist and New York Times bestselling author, Dr. Lisa Damour. Lisa is the executive director of the Laurel School Center for Research on Girls and is the author of Untangled, Guiding Teenage Girls Through the 7 Transitions into Adulthood. She is also the author of Under Pressure, Confronting the Epidemic of Stress and Anxiety in Girls, which was just released yesterday, and she writes a monthly adolescence column for the New York Times. She is joining us from her office in Shaker Heights, Ohio. Lisa, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm very glad to be here.
So I'd like to ask you to start, if you would please, by reading a passage from your first book, Untangled, and it's actually a quote from Anna Freud, who is was the daughter of Sigmund Freud, and is actually an esteemed psychologist in her own right. And in this passage, she's actually describing adolescence for us.
I'm so glad this is the one you chose. I think that this should be skywritten over any home with a teenager in it. Yes. I take it that it is normal for an adolescent to behave for a considerable length of time in an inconsistent and unpredictable manner, to fight her impulses and accept them, to love her parents and to hate them, to revolt against them and be dependent on them, to be deeply ashamed to acknowledge her mother before others, and, unexpectedly, to desire heart-to-heart talks with her, to thrive on imitation of others while searching unceasingly for her own identity, to be more idealistic, artistic, generous, and unselfish than she will ever be again, but also the opposite, self-centered, egoistic, calculating. Such fluctuations and extreme opposites would be deemed highly abnormal at any other time of life. At this time, they may signify no more than that an adult structure of personality takes a long time to emerge, that the individual in question does not cease to experiment, and is in no hurry to close down on possibilities.
Okay, wow, that is fascinating. Even though I was obviously a teenage girl once myself, that is news to me. Maybe it was just a long time ago. I don't know.
I think we're all a little amnesic for who we were as teenagers. I think our own memory is always selective, and I think it is often the case that we were much more, kind of unpredictable than we thought we were.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm really excited to bring this discussion to listeners today for a couple reasons. One of the things I hear a lot from widowed parents is this idea of, how do I know if something is a grief issue or if something is a normal teenage issue? So I'd love for you to help us understand what normal looks like. And of course, like you just said, normal's all over the map. So in that case, then, what does not normal or potentially problematic also look like? And then how does grief come into play on these different issues, of course? The second reason that I think this will be helpful, I hear a lot from widowed parents about the stress of losing their parenting partner, the pressure now, their new role as a single parent. They're really the only parent of these kids, having to make all the decisions. So I'm thinking that the more you can help us understand our teenagers, the better equipped we will be in our new roles here. Sound good?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, great. So you have identified 7 different developmental tasks, and you call them strands, that teenagers are going through as they transition from childhood into being full-grown adults. So let's take these one at a time here. The first one you call parting with childhood. What's that one about?
So, and these are arranged sort of roughly in developmental order, but they're all kind of going on simultaneously. But often, I think the first way that parents realize they've got a teenager on their hands is that their child doesn't want to seem so childish anymore. You know, you can't call them the cute little nickname you used to do. They don't want to cuddle in the ways they used to. Being cool becomes, more of a premium is placed upon it. They want to be more separate. They want to close the door to their bedroom. That's the typical sort of earliest signs of adolescence. And it usually begins around age 11 or 12. And I think people are sometimes surprised by how early it starts. And I think that's largely been a public relations problem on psychology side, because we've always understood that adolescence begins right around age 11. But I think because of the phrase teenager, people feel like, no, you've got a child until they're 13, and tween is sort of a cheat, that they still should be little kids or like kid-like until 13, and then, adolescence begins. But typically by, 5th or 6th grade, and 7th at the latest, kids will want to not be seen as babyish and not do the kinds of things that feel to them like little kid things.
Okay. So, and I think some of the things that you see that you talked about, the kids are starting to pull away from their parents. So I guess one of the things I'm thinking about is if a parent has died, and yet the kid is feeling like they're needing to pull away from their parents because of their age and developmental stage, but maybe based on this traumatic event in their life, I don't know, maybe they feel they need to seek support from their parents, or maybe they don't. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think what you're describing is so apt, right? Which is that it destabilizes this normal process, right? That if everything stayed as it was, if there was no death of a parent, the child would, kind of hole up in their room and come down for dinner, and that would, the parents would kind of grumble about it, and that would be the extent of it. But without question, when there's a loss and then all of the trauma that goes around the loss, I think it can really complicate for the kid what it means to push away from the remaining parent. And yet at the same time, I think it can make seeking support from the remaining parent pretty fraught, right? Because that can feel regressive, that can feel babyish, to want to cuddle or to want to cry with the parent who's surviving, and so it can mean that adolescents, especially at this juncture, may feel like they're not really sure where they're supposed to go for support, because they need support, but they don't want to be like a baby about it, and that be like a baby thing is pretty powerful for them. And it's interesting to think about the ways in which other adults could be helpful, right? Like a great aunt, or a terrific, family friend who could offer a lot of comfort and a lot of, support in a way that doesn't feel like, oh man, like I feel like a little kid looking to my, my mom or dad for this kind of help.
Okay. All right. That's a great idea. And I was also thinking about, I guess I wonder if there could be some challenges if maybe the child has started the pulling away process, and then one of the parents dies. Could they sometimes feel guilty, like, oh, I should have spent more time with them? But do you see that? And how do
I could easily imagine that, right? That when they're pulling away from us, usually what also means is that they really want to be with their friends, and the drive to be with their friends is the second task. They're joining a new tribe. So they pull away from us, they loosen their ties to life at home, and it's not like they just loosen their ties, they actually strengthen ties elsewhere, right? And this is under typical conditions, like how they start to move their way out the door, right? That we want them to actually loosen their ties to us and strengthen their ties to their peers, because that's really where their investments are going to shift. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, I think you're very right, that if that process is underway and it's normal and healthy, it then also does stand to, again, be pretty conflictual for a kid who, if everybody's going to be at this party, they want to be at that party, right? I mean, that there's very little that's more powerful than that to a 7th or 8th grader or 9th grader. But, if you go to the party and miss some critical time with a parent who doesn't have a lot of time, that could feel really hard. I think, in those moments, if I think about them clinically, when I've confronted those with people I've cared for, I'll often say, like, this is one of those moments where nothing you do is going to be quite right. That there's no answer that makes us feel good, right? That if you go to the party, which of course you're going to want to go, you're going to feel bad about not being home. And if you stay home, you're going to feel bad about not being at the party. The question is, which one are you most able to live with or feel comfortable with or bear?
Mm-hmm. And I almost wonder if just having that discussion and acknowledging that dual reality even just helps in itself.
It does, because I think there can be for kids and some grown-ups also the sense of, like, there's a right answer here. I'm just trying to figure out which one it is. Mm-hmm. And it's a great relief to say, oh, no, there's no right answer. You've got 2 bad options. Right? You have 2 bad options. And so there will be downsides to no matter what you choose. And so it's a matter of kind of weighing the downsides here.
Maybe you feel a little less bad that you couldn't make a perfect choice, so you just go with one of them. And
exactly. But kids get really hung up, in some grown-ups, on trying to, like, I just have to come to the right decision. No, they're both bad.
Right. Okay. All right. And before we get deeper into the finding the new tribe, sticking with the parting with childhood, one of the things you talked about in that section about the need for increased privacy being a good thing, and that they're going to want to hang out in their rooms with the door closed. Developmentally, it's appropriate, normal, even desirable, all those things. I'm wondering how a parent could tell, or I guess, do they need to be worried about whether it starts crossing a line into, like, the kid is depressed and they won't come out of their room? How can you tell if they're in their room and they won't come out because they're depressed, or if they're in their room and they won't come out because they're a teenager and they're separate?
Because they're 12. Right. And they've had a really long day and they're tired of every human being on the planet. And
exactly.
They've been surrounded by humans all day who they didn't choose, and they need a little time to themselves.
Right. And for those of us who are not experts in this, it's really hard to know.
It's a hard call. So there's a few ways to slice this. I think at the more granular level, I'm a huge believer in just asking kids very straight questions. So I think in a moment when things are good and you're chatting and it's relaxed and the child doesn't feel cornered, you could say, okay, some days you come home from school and you hole up in your room and I can't tell if something's wrong or not. How would I know if something were wrong? And I think actually just asking, like, if you ask a kid a straight question, it is amazing how often they will give you a very straight answer.
Okay.
So that's a place, or even if you storm off to your room and then don't come out for 3 hours, how will I know when I should actually make a thing of it, and how will I know just to leave you be? Like, can you give me any, like, guidance here?
Okay.
I think an overarching principle, and this actually comes from Anna Freud, who you can tell I really admire her work. I mean, her work is very, very old. In terms of knowing if something's really going wrong for a child, and this is so valuable in adolescence when normal adolescence is such a chaotic time and teenagers can be kind of difficult and, hard to understand. The definition is if there's an interference with progressive development. So the way we want to think about it is that it's a kid's job to grow. And they're growing in all these ways. They're developing their social skills. They're developing their academic and intellectual skills. They're becoming increasingly physically autonomous. They can take better and better care of themselves and their own bodies. They are able to manage their feelings with increasing, kind of sophistication. They don't hit. They don't, do inappropriate things. They either talk about their feelings or they use good coping strategies. And so there are all of these ways in which we expect to see kids grow. And the sign that something really is amiss is that their growth has stopped, in one of these domains, that they are not able to maintain friendships, or they are not developing at school intellectually, or their ability to care for themselves is either not progressing or going backwards, right? Or their handling of hard feelings seems like they're not developing an increasing capacity to handle difficult feelings well. That's actually how we measure clinically whether something is amiss with a kid. Because teenagers have meltdowns all the time. Mm-hmm. Like, that kind of comes with having a teenager, is that they're going to have a meltdown. We wouldn't say that about a child, well, toddlers for sure, but we don't expect 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds to have meltdowns all the time. But we do expect 13-year-olds have meltdowns pretty often. And so that's where that Anna Freud quote that we started with is so useful, which is like, they're going to be all over the map. They're going to be charming and horrible, often in the same 10-minute space. All of that's really to be expected. What matters is if they stop growing.
Okay. All right. I think that's a useful guidepost. And another thing I was thinking about this partying with childhood, do you think that this task is harder depending on when, like, for example, if a child lost a parent when they were 2 or when they were 12, do you think that affects this task at all?
I'm sure it does. We make such a big distinction around events like the death of a parent based on when it occurred, right? Because everything's sort of happening in the developmental box the kid is in. So the loss of a parent for a 2-year-old has a very profoundly different meaning, than it does for the child who's 12 when the parent dies. And so I think we could expect to see, and I don't know that I can come up with sort of pithy certainties about how it what it means for kids at different ages. But I definitely think I would say that every single developmental task I talk about in adolescence is not only shaped by bereavement, but also shaped by the age at which the bereavement occurred.
Okay. All right. Useful to think about. And then you mentioned in your book a couple of different categories in this parting with childhood task of when parents might be concerned. The first one you call the female Peter Pan. What's that one about?
So this is where there's a not growing up, and so this is a good example of, for this developmental task of parting with childhood, where we see an interference with progressive development. So these are kids who just stay really young even as they age, that they're telling their parent everything. They hang out with the parent on the weekend. They're not becoming increasingly independent. They're not branching out. They can seem babyish to their peers. And it's, I know the way I wrote it up is they seem at once sort of babyish and also too adult to their peers. Like, swearing makes them uncomfortable. Parties, make them too uncomfortable. There's sort of a kind of a fussiness, that sometimes happens for these kids. And it's just really, it means that it's very hard for them to, become independent. It's very hard for them to build the peer relationships that are going to help them make their way out into the world. So that's one grounds for concern.
Mm-hmm. And I think in that area you were also talking about the parents have a role to play in this too. The parent needs to be able to handle the rejection or the pushing away of the teenager. The parent needs to not take it personally. The parent needs to be basically strong enough to play that role and let the kid push off. And I'm thinking about whether then the parent's own loss can complicate that. They're dealing with this massive challenge of parenting at a time when their own self is, maybe at one of their lowest points. So I guess, what is my question? I don't know. I'm thinking about, what does the parent need to be thinking about in terms of helping the child with this task and their own mental health or, emotional standing?
I think this is such a good moment of, first they have to put on their own oxygen mask in order to be able to do what needs to be done, right? And I think you're totally right that, under typical conditions, having your 15-year-old, 16, 17, 18-year-old start to really move away from you and then eventually move out is exquisitely painful. It's a massive loss in its own right, and it's often made worse that there's sometimes a quality where they, even though it shouldn't feel as a personal rejection, sometimes teenagers can act very rejecting of their parents, and it's hard to not take that personally.
Uh-huh.
I think what I would advise to the bereaved parent or the widowed parent is that this is normal and expectable, and that fundamentally you do want to support normal development. You don't want your child to feel like they can't carry on with the work of being a teenager that was waiting for them because of the loss. And so this is where I would say to bereaved parents, like, this is where you need your own supports. This is where you need your own support group. This is where you need, people around you to help you manage both the pain of losing your kid, right? Because that's hard under normal conditions, and also the way in which the losing of your kid, and it's not losing, but the pushing away, that, the letting go, is going to poke the bruise of the bereavement, right? I mean, I think that's how we have to think about it. But I say all the time in talks to large audiences of parents, I say, look, if you are going into your teenager's adolescence and you don't have a way to feel good and loved and valued in the world beyond how your teenager treats you, like, you need to get that. Because it really is, it's not going to work if your sense of feeling cared for and attended to and honored and valued is riding on how your teenager's feeling day to day.
Okay, and the parent might be vulnerable to that if they've, their spouse is gone. That might have been their main source of support, and now it's them and maybe a couple kids or whatever in the house. Yeah. Okay. All right.
And I talk in Untangled about single parenting a teenager, and I don't know that I make a distinction whether it's divorce or bereavement or never married, but I say that I actually think single parenting a teenager is one of the hardest things I've ever seen anyone do. And that some of the most meaningful work I've gotten to do in my practice is when I'm caring for the parent who comes in and uses me almost as a partner in withstanding their teenager, and just talks about, and then she said this, and then she said that, and I say, oh man, that must have really stung, and like, here's ways you can, make it clear that she can't speak to you that way, but supporting them as they hold up under the the vicissitudes of having a teenager in the house, which is a lot. It's a lot to manage.
Yeah. Okay. So finding a good therapist and a good panel of parent friends to
yes,
commiserate and bounce off.
Yes,
okay.
And who you can call and who can back you and can say, it's so stinks to be, there's only 3 of you in the house and one of them hates you right now, and you've got nobody who's on your side. That's not fun at all.
Right. Okay. And then the other situation you called out about when a parent might be concerned rushing into adulthood. What did you mean by that?
So that's, when we see kids who are way ahead developmentally, who are 13 and they are going to parties and they're drinking and they're, getting pretty involved physically with, since I focus on girls, so in heterosexual situations, they're getting pretty involved physically with boys. We don't really expect to see that in 13-year-olds. That is, if anything, end of high school behavior. And so it's always worrisome if you see a kid who's really on the fast track.
Okay. And let's see. Oh, something that you said was interesting. Girls don't part with childhood in one fell swoop. Their skills or their confidence in their skills develops at an uneven pace. Let her do it on her own. I don't think I have a question about that. I just thought that was a really interesting for me to think about.
Yeah.
Okay. And so let's talk then about the second task, which was joining a new tribe, which we already started to cross into a little bit. So the important developmental tasks of this strand, then I think you were talking about, okay, if they're separating from their family, they're not becoming anchorless. They need to find a new tribe. So why is that important?
Well, you can't be alone in the world, right? And so there is this, I think, kind of precarious moment where, my mom can't touch me anymore. I don't want to, be seen out to dinner with those people. But I want to be connected to other people. And so a lot of this happens in 7th grade, like, who are my people going to be and who's my new crew? And, and it's pretty stressful because it's a whole bunch of kids all at once trying to figure out who their new crew is going to be. And a lot gets caught up in it. And, if we think about it over the broad span of adolescent development, what we would expect is that by 11th grade, our kids have one or two at least really solid friendships, somebody outside the family, a kid their age, that they really share things with and are very close with, and may learn much more, know much more about our kid at that age than we ourselves do. That's where we want this to head. However ambivalent we may feel about losing that kind of intimacy with them. The goal is that it's not that friends replace parents, but that friends, age mates, start to fill the space that was filled by the parent. The parent fills less of that space, and age mates fill more of it.
Right. Interesting. Okay, so this is then helping me understand, I think, why middle school gets such a bad rap as being such a tough time for kids generally across the board.
Yeah, it's loaded. I mean, they need their people, but everybody's scrambling all at once, and not everyone's in agreement about who wants to be with whom.
Which reminds me, you talked about the concept of popularity and the fact that it's not really a coincidence that that concept really emerges for the first time in middle school as being a really strong.
Yes, the sense of like, oh, wouldn't it be great to have a lot of social ties, right? There is a worry about being kind of alone in the world, and so I think a sense of like, oh, the more social ties you can have, the better, right? Which the research doesn't actually ultimately support that works very well for kids. But
yeah, can you talk about that? Because I read or saw you talking somewhere about like the idea of having maybe one or two close friends might actually be more helpful and more important.
Oh yeah. No, there's a lot of evidence that one or two close friends reduces stress quite a bit. That having lots and lots of friends can actually take it out of a kid, even if they're good and happy friendships. So let's start with the good and happy friendships possibility. Then you just are managing a lot of social ties. There's a lot of kids who you're trying to divide your time among, or who, maybe you want to get together with some of them, but they don't all like each other. There's like all of that. And then, the truth is that once you get above 2 or 3 kids, once you've got a group of 4 or 5, there will be drama. Like there's no way to not have drama. That there's no way that 5 kids of the same age can like one another equally. There's no way that 5 adults of the same age could like one another equally. But those sort of, there's always like predictable drama that comes up when kids try to coalesce in these larger groups.
Interesting. And so you talked about if you have 1 or 2 close friends, then it's not really a question, who am I going to see this weekend? Who am I going to the movie with? Like, you got your people, they're your go-to people, and it takes all that drama out of the situation.
Exactly.
That's so interesting. Okay. The other thing I was thinking about in this developmental strand about joining new tribes, sometimes you see, a family loses a parent. They might have to think about moving. Maybe because of financial issues. Maybe they're going to move in with grandparents. Maybe they need to or want to sell the house and move to someplace different, either locally or out of the community. And I guess I'm wondering how that relates to this finding a tribe thing. And is there a better or worse time to think about making some kind of move like that? Or how should parents try to think about that and manage it?
Well, what has to be done has to be done. I think that, like, I would never want a parent to feel guilty about a choice that they didn't really have, right? Like, if you got to move, you got to move. What I would say is, don't underestimate what a big deal friendships are at this age. And so, a move might need to happen, but there would need to be a lot of empathy around how that will accrue to be a new loss, for their kid, especially if their kid's really well plugged in socially and likes their friends a lot and has a good group. I think that there has to be a lot of promise of, ways to stay connected to those friends. It's hard. It's not the same as being in school. But, one of the things, I've done a lot of divorce work and bereavement work in my work as a clinician, and I divide the problems that accrue into 2 different buckets. So there's the bucket of things for which there's a practical solution, right? So, maybe, mom used to always do the driving to, to soccer, and mom isn't here anymore, so we recruit a lovely neighbor, or we carpool a lot. There's a solution to be had. There's something that can be done about it that functionally fixes the hassle that arrives. Right. And then there are problems that aren't solvable. where nothing can be done. And that may be, like, we got to move. Like, we can't stay in this house, or we need to be, we're going to go live closer to your grandparents for the support that comes with them, or, who knows what. And so for those problems, there's no practical solution. There's nothing that makes it go away. And so then for those problems, what works is tremendous empathy for the child.
Mm-hmm.
To say, like, I get it that this feels awful, and I get it that this feels like a new way to lose, or that the loss that came with losing mom just got bigger and bigger. You're losing all these other things on top of that loss. And that must feel awful, and I am so sorry. And if there were any other way, we would choose it. And I know that for a parent that will feel so inadequate. But one of the things that really stayed with me from my training, and that I have felt is true, is that it's an enormous gift to feel with a child. To make it clear that I can feel what you're feeling. I can empathize with it, and I can tolerate that it's uncomfortable. I'm not going to try to talk you out of it or tell you how great it's going to be, in the new house.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just, this stinks, and I'm so sorry. And it's a new loss on an old loss, and that's not fun for anybody.
Mm-hmm. And so not to be tempted to say things like, oh, there's kids on the street, there's some kids your age next door, I'm sure you'll be fine.
It'll be great. Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, what usually works is to say, I can't promise you this is going to be, I can't promise you it's going to be great. Like, I don't know. I'm here to make sure it's bearable. Right? So I think that sometimes when parents actually kind of downplay, like I have no expectations that this is going to be some magical solution to make everything feel better. It may actually feel kind of crummy in a new way. Mm-hmm. That actually creates room for kids to be like, oh, actually, it turns out there was a kid across the street I kind of liked. When parents are cheerleading, like, it's going to be amazing, it's basically an invitation for the kid to be like, no, it's not, and here's why. So sometimes lowballing it can help.
Okay. And the other thing I'm thinking about in terms of tribes and kids and peers is, a kid who's maybe lost a parent feeling like their peers just don't get it. They don't know where they're coming from. Yes. Yeah. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. This I have heard a lot, and I've written about a little bit. I sent you a piece I wrote a long time ago about bereavement in adolescence.
New York Times, which I'm going to link to in the show notes because it was
good. Yeah, thank you. So it is really hard. I mean, and this is especially focusing on teenagers because that's what I write about for the Times. I've taken care of bereaved teenagers throughout my practice, and it is so common for them to say to me that it's excruciating to listen to their friends complain. Mm-hmm. That they'll be sitting at lunch and they're listening to their friends complain about what strike them and probably are like the dumbest things. Like, that's how they'll describe it. Their friends will complain about like, oh, I didn't get the shoes I wanted, or, like, I can't believe my folks made me mow the lawn this weekend, and they'll do this right next to or in front of a kid who just lost a parent, or lost a parent 3 months ago. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they'll complain about their parents and how annoying they are, right in front of a peer who is just in a completely different place. And it is so hard for them to stomach it because it just seems so superficial and so dumb and so unfeeling. Mm-hmm. My experience is that it's not that kids are trying to be crummy about it. I think the reality is, mostly I defend teenagers, but teenagers, it is true, are very egocentric. They're very caught up in their own worlds. Mm-hmm. And so they just aren't thinking about their friend and how the words may land for their friend. Mm-hmm. And I also think, time moves really fast for teenagers. So for them, like something that happened 3 months ago, like your dad died 3 months ago, like it's not even so much on their radar anymore. And so, obviously 3 months is no time in bereavement time. Mm-hmm. But for classmates, they're kind of on to the next thing, you know? And so it can be very painful to have peers who just don't get it, can't get it.
And so that seems like it could mess up this objective of like tribe finding.
It can definitely get in the way. It can definitely get in the way.
Yeah.
Or not get in the way of finding a tribe, but getting in the way of feeling like you really like they get you, in the ways that you want to be understood by peers.
Yeah, because it seems like, you would like to find a tribe of people that you really can feel close to and to get support from. And if you're feeling like these kids are on a different page here or not, I can't maybe be myself around them or whatever, it's going to be harder to feel like you're finding that tribe that's really solid and
I think
healthy.
It can be. And this is where it's also very nice. I know lots of communities have, places that have bereavement groups for kids, and it's not like that will replace one's school friends, but it can be a way to feel like, okay, I have someone around my age who does get it.
Sure. Okay. And then you called out a few different things parents might see in this joining a new tribe strand, where parents might be concerned if they're seeing social isolation, for example.
Yeah, kids need friends. They need at least one.
Mm-hmm.
They don't need lots, but they need at least one. And I will tell you, in terms of social worries I would have about a kid, if they've got no friends, we're at DEF CON 5, and if they've got one friend, we could be at DEF CON 1. It could be one great friend. It could be happy as can be, right? But the absence of a single friend is very concerning.
Okay. And then the other two you mentioned were being bullied or being a bully.
Yeah. That, conflict comes with the territory when you've got kids, but, in groups. But bullying, where a kid is really being targeted in a very deliberate way and there's a total imbalance of power, that's not normal. And not just kids being kids. Okay.
Let's move on then to the third strand here, developmentally, harnessing emotions. So what's going on here? What's the important work that kids are doing here?
Well, so feelings get very, very big for all teenagers.
Can you explain about the brain development from the back to the front? Yeah. That was fascinating.
Yeah, no, and it's really helpful to understand. So in the course of normal adolescence, the brain remodels, and it becomes much faster, much more efficient, much more powerful. And this is it's so fun it's very different to have an 8th grader than it is to have a sophomore, right? I mean, they're just in terms of how their minds work. They're like worlds apart. It remodels not all at once, though. It remodels gradually in the order in which it developed initially. And so it remodels first the primitive regions, which are sort of above the neck, get upgraded and become more powerful, and those contain the emotions. And then later, the sophisticated sort of perspective maintaining systems behind the forehead, they get upgraded, and those, allow for reasoning and the ability to maintain perspective. And so there is a juncture in adolescence when the brain is what we call gawky, when the emotion centers have been fully upgraded and are extremely powerful, but the perspective maintaining systems are not fully at their full strength. And so what it means is that when your teenager is calm, they can reason wonderfully. They're very capable of reasoning. If they become upset, the emotion centers are sufficiently powerful that they can hijack the entire system and crash it down. So it's something that, this is the meltdowns we see in teenagers. And it's very alarming to the teenager and to the parent. And usually, though, if the parent can be calm and supportive, the brain will reset all by itself. It's not a sign that something is terribly wrong, even though you do have a 14-year-old in a fetal position on your kitchen floor sobbing. It's a sign that the brain got hijacked by emotion. And if the parent can be supportive and say, do you want some water? Do you want me to stay with you? Do you want some time alone? That usually lets things reset.
Okay. I have to say that I stopped by Michael's yesterday and I bought some glitter. Can you tell us about the glitter jar?
Sure. So this comes up in Under Pressure, and it's exactly the same thing. So I've taken care of a lot of teenage meltdowns. This has been something I see in my practice, and I work 2 days a week at a girls' school. I consult over there, and so I was at a girls' school in Dallas, and we were talking about girls having meltdowns during the school day, which does happen sometimes. And one of the counselors there said, "Oh, well, that's when I get out a glitter jar." And I was like, "What? What?
What is she talking about?"
What is she talking about? And so she went and got one, and it was a jam jar. It was full of water and had sparkly purple glitter. And she shook it up, and she said, "When a girl comes to my office and she's melting down, I do this." And she shook it and shook it. and it was like a snow globe. It just went completely, all the sparkling purple glitter just was flying around. And then she says, and then I put it down and I say to her, this is your brain right now, right? And it really is a great model of the way in which the emotional glitter can hijack the whole system. Mm-hmm. And then she says, and then I say to her, so first, let's settle your glitter. Mm-hmm. And that they would, the way her model, watching the glitter settle is actually quite calming and mesmerizing. Mm. But even if a parent doesn't want to make a glitter jar, which, and no 15-year-old is going to go for a glitter jar, it's certainly not at home. Maybe at school, but not at home. Uh-huh. I've come to feel that the real utility is the instructions for the parent, right? Which is to just slow down, assume this will right itself. Do not worry that this is on fire. Treat it instead like a wave. Emotions rise and they crest and they recede. And we can count on young people largely to be self-correcting systems if we're patient. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think you mentioned a minute ago about teenagers themselves maybe being alarmed by their emotions.
Yeah.
I guess, well, actually, first, can you tell us what latency is, this period right before teenagerhood?
Yeah, so the term we use in my field is latency, sort of like ages 6 to 10-ish. So the way we think about it is 0 to 5 is, early childhood, and that's extremely challenging. And then adolescence is 11 to 18, 19, and that's pretty challenging. But we talk about latency between ages 6 to 10 as things go quiet. They become latent, emotions are sort of milder, which is this is why kids in latency are a lot of fun. They sort of have projects and they think we're funny and they have collections and they like to be with us, right? Uh-huh. But it's funny. I've now started to think about it. The terminology, if I were starting from scratch, I would probably call it high maintenance, low maintenance, high maintenance. Because that's what it feels like as a parent. In terms of caring for a kid, it's actually a lot harder to care for, I think, a 13-year-old than a 9-year-old.
Interesting.
I wish we were more. I wish psychologists did a better job of communicating that, because I think people feel like it should get progressively easier. But no, you got a break, and now you're back in.
Well, and so as a parent, I think because maybe you've gotten used to that low maintenance or latency period, and you're like, hey, I got this, right? More or less, right? Yeah. And then it sounds like the parents and the kids themselves are surprised by that change.
They are, and especially the emotionality piece. I think that really catches everybody off guard. And I talk about this in Untangled, that one of the things that was said to me in my training that has really held me in good stead, I remember the supervisor who said it. She said, you've got to work with the assumption that every teenager secretly worries that they're crazy. And I thought, oh, come on. But I think the destabilization that we just talked about is pretty alarming for the teenager. Mm-hmm. And then I think in bereavement, there can be ways in which this gets amplified, this worry about oneself. Because, it's not unusual for me to have bereaved adolescents say, I had this impulse where I was going to call my dad, and then, of course, they can't call their dad. And then I think in this sort of framework of what's wrong with me? I'm a teenager. Is there something wrong with me? I think that those sort of totally expectable impulses can then, kids can think, have I lost my mind that I think I could pick up the phone and call him, And so I'm always really trying to jump on those moments to say, oh, no, that's a totally normal and expectable thing. That's a sign of your health, that you're staying connected in that way. So I think that bereavement can create conditions that make kids even more worried that there's something really wrong. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I'm thinking also about, I guess, helping kids handle their emotions. I'm thinking about whether it's the mom or the dad that has died, or, which one is a surviving parent. And I don't know if there's any differences in what you see, or different challenges that moms have and different challenges that dads have, and kind of helping the kids manage their emotions.
I would say it really comes down to the individuals, right? I mean that, right now, my daughters talk to me about their feelings. They don't talk so much to their dad about their feelings, right? So if I were gone, right, that would be a factor. Mm-hmm. But you know, in other families, it works in different ways, you know, and so I think it more comes down to sort of how were those transactions occurring in the past?
Okay.
And then, you know, and then what remains.
So what were those family roles and communication pathways, not based on gender, but based on the particular family and how they were operating?
Yeah, the dynamics that were in place.
Gotcha. Okay. You talked about something that I thought was a really good visual, this emotional hot potato. Parents are the emotional dumping ground, and teenagers like to toss their hot potatoes at them. What's that all about?
You know, it's funny, after I wrote Untangled, I switched that metaphor to what I think is a better one, which is dumping emotional garbage. You know, I think that to be a kid is, you have to collect a lot of emotional garbage in the course of a school day. You know, a lot goes wrong that you just take in stride. You know, you're assigned to a group with a kid you really don't like, and there's nothing you can do about it, and then you didn't study for a class, and it turns out you have a pop quiz, and you just have to sit there and, like, muddle your way through it. And I think that all day long kids collect emotional garbage. They sort of jam it in their, you know, psychological pockets, and then I think they get home and we're like, how was school? And, like, out comes the garbage, right? And, and you know, I hated this kid, I was in my group, and then this dumb pop quiz is going to mess up my grade, and they're sort of chucking it at the parent. And I think in this moment we want to be like, well, wait, what's wrong with this kid? Or maybe he's okay, or why didn't you study? And, like, they don't want to process it. They just want to dump the garbage. And and I think if parents can see it as that, they feel less bad taking it on, right? Because the kid just wants to be rid of it. And so I think it can be helpful, you know, when you say, how was your day? You know, you, like, just picture yourself opening up a garbage can, right? And you don't have to take it on. You don't have to carry their garbage around. You just have to relieve them of it.
Well, and I think you even said you could ask them, do you want my help with what you're describing, or are you just venting?
Yep, and I will tell you that is, like, the most useful thing. I mean, and 90% of the time the kid will say, I just need to vent. And this is also what adults do, right? Like, they come home from a long day and they just need to air out all the annoyances of the day. They don't want people to tell them, oh, well, maybe your colleague isn't that bad after all. You know, I mean, they just want to dump it. Right,
exactly. Okay. So if in this strand, the parents are trying to help, you know, the teen has the task eventually of learning to harness their emotions. The parents can play a role in helping that. When should parents be concerned? What might they see that would, you know, lead them to think this is something that is beyond this all over the place normal?
So first of all, they should be all over the place. So we don't want to see kids getting stuck in a rut, right? If a child is sort of down or extraordinarily anxious day after day, you know, that's concerning. And then the other thing we want to be mindful of is when their coping skills are harmful. So, you know, everybody's going to have emotion. Teenagers are going to have a lot. Bereaved teenagers are going to have a lot. What they need are good coping skills. And coping is very personal and very individual. And, you know, what works for one kid's not going to work for another, but we want healthy adaptive coping. We want them to, you know, use coping things like talking to people they love, or going for a run, or, you know, looking through old photos. Those are all great coping skills. We are not huge fans of drinking, drugs, self-harm, promiscuity as a way to cope with hard feelings. So that's the other thing we want to watch is, you know, are they managing feelings in ways that are going to make things better or worse ultimately?
Okay. And something I thought was interesting, you said depression can show up differently in teens sometimes than it does in other people?
Yes, this is something, this is a really important takeaway. In adolescence in particular, depression can take the form of intense irritability. And the best way to describe is that it feels like you're living with a porcupine. And it's not unusual for teenagers to be irritable with their parents. You don't want them to be irritable every day, all day. What's really worrisome is when adolescents are irritable with everybody. They can't stand their friends. They can't stand the grown-ups at school. They can't stand their coaches. They can't stand their siblings. They can't stand you. That's unusual.
Okay.
It's very common for teenagers to be like, oh my God, my parents are so annoying. Like, that for me that's nothing. But if a teenager says, and every teacher at my school is like the worst, and no, I don't like hanging out with anybody, and, you know, the kids on my team make me crazy, like, that really starts to get my attention.
Okay. Okay. And then on anxiety, it was interesting in Under Pressure, you talked about sometimes a lot of anxiety, stress could be helpful. I mean, stress could help you study for a test because you realize you're not prepared. Anxiety could be a warning signal that you're at this party and it might go south and maybe you should listen and get out of there. So I guess so I think that's really important to understand. And then when does it cross a line, though, into like the anxiety system is going haywire and sending signals about things that it really are not threats?
So this isn't really like one of the main takeaways from Under Pressure, the book that just came out, which is that stress and anxiety are normal and healthy functions. Like, and that message somehow has gotten lost in the culture. That stress is what happens when people work at the edge of their capacities or do something that requires a lot of adaptation. It usually fosters growth. It usually causes people to be able to do more than they thought they could do, or more than they used to be able to do. And in bereavement, obviously it's enormously stressful. Some of the research I cite in Under Pressure is something we call the inoculating effect of stress. They're going through something very, very difficult and weathering it, getting through it, pretty much intact, actually means that people are more able to handle new difficulties that come their way. So for instance, if your dad dies when you're 13, that's horrible. It also means that when you don't make the team you wanted as a ninth grader, you're like, you know what? I've dealt with worse, right? That there is that does in fact accrue to a durability that is valuable, right? I mean, we would never want to get it this way, but it shouldn't be underestimated that it actually helps kids be sturdier if they are able to be helped through something very, very difficult. And then anxiety is it's a natural warning system. We all come equipped with it. It's programmed, through evolution, and it alerts us to threats. So like you said, if we're at a party and it's kind of out of control, we should feel anxious, and that anxiety tells us to like do something, like go home. It also alerts us to internal threats, right? If you're messing around on Facebook when you're supposed to be getting ready for a meeting, right, eventually you should feel kind of anxious about that. And that's a good way that you think like, okay, I should probably quit, and go get ready for the meeting. Both stress and anxiety can spin out of control. Stress can be traumatic stress, like we don't want that. And it's a trauma when it overwhelms the person's capacities to cope, right? When it's bigger than their ability to withstand it. We don't want chronic stress, when there's no possibility of recovering from stress. This person's sort of being beaten down by overwhelming demands on a daily basis. And anxiety can grow out of control when the alarm system stops making sense, when it's going off all the time over like nothing, or it's blaring over something tiny, like if a kid's having a panic attack over a quiz, that's not the alarm system working as it should.
Okay.
But even when those things happen, we're really good at treating them. Like we know what to do on the clinical side. So we don't want it to get there, but if it does get there, people don't have to feel helpless about that either.
Well, that brings me to an interesting question. Let's say you want help, clinical, you want a professional involved here. What is the difference? Like, so I know there are people like you who are PhD clinical psychologists, and there are people who are master's level therapists of various types. So what are the differences, besides just you went to school longer, right?
Oh, I did, yeah.
Right, no, I know. But like, what does it mean for a family who needs help of like where they should go?
Almost nothing. It means almost nothing.
Okay.
That there are MSWs in my community that I refer to constantly, and PhDs I would never send anybody to.
Okay.
So what I would say to families that are looking for help is that they should talk to their pediatrician. Often pediatricians are really plugged into the landscape in a community, sort of like what's clinically available. And also, your pediatrician will know your kids, right? And they'll have a feel for your kid's personality and your personality. And so pediatricians can often be pretty good matchmakers between, who the established and reputable clinicians are in the community and the family, and make a good connection there.
Okay, yeah. That's helpful. Let's go to this next strand here, contending with adult authority. So what's going on with this one?
So it is the job of teenagers to start to question adults and to not buy everything we're selling. And so one of the things that we need to recognize as parents is that this is coming, and it is a sign of normal and healthy development, however unpleasant it may be.
Okay.
But it is absolutely the case that teenagers will start to doubt us, make fun of us, point out our shortcomings, and also come home and describe in rich detail all the shortcomings of their teachers and coaches too. and this is development doing what it should.
Right. Okay. There are 3 more strands here, which are all really important. I'm not sure we're going to have time to get to them today. One is planning for the future. One is entering the romantic world, and one is caring for herself, learning to ultimately make that transition to do that as an adult. Any brief comments on those 3?
Well, so in terms of planning for the future, we really expect by 9th and 10th grade that kids are thinking about what comes after high school, and are taking seriously that they will be moving on, which is not to say that 9th graders need to know what they want to make of their lives, but we don't want 9th graders making choices that foreclose opportunities after high school. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, obviously, as 10th, 11th, and 12th grade come along, certainly 11th and 12th, planning for what one's doing after high school becomes suddenly a lot more urgent. Entering the romantic world is a big, complicated one, and it's probably every parent's least favorite chapter of my book.
I thought it was very useful and interesting.
Oh, I think it's useful. I think people just would rather not have to deal with it. But I do think that, part of normal adolescence is having some sort of love life, but that doesn't mean having a boyfriend or a girlfriend. It can mean having a huge crush on, Justin Bieber or whoever the person is at the moment, but sort of connecting with one sense of romance and wanting to be part of something romantic.
Sure.
And then caring for themselves, that really is where this is all headed. This sort of ultimately they should be able to manage themselves autonomously, really look out for their own best interests, look after themselves in meaningful ways. They shouldn't need to be supervised all the time as seniors. They should be assessing risks not in terms of whether they're going to get caught, but whether they could get hurt. That those are the kinds of sophisticated reasonings that we want to see by 12th grade. And it doesn't have to be every minute of 12th grade, but on balance, we want, especially if they're going to leave home and go to college, we want there to be a sense of a transition from I, the parent, am responsible for caring for you to you yourself are responsible for caring for you, and I'm here to help as needed.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And I just throw out here for listeners, because I really encourage you to get both of these books. About Untangled, the Washington Post said it's the most down-to-earth, readable parenting book I've come across in a long time. Psychology Today said it's like having a 24/7 therapist at your beck and call. So guys, go get these books, because this is, I learned a lot from reading these, and I hope you will too. Okay, I think we're out of time here. Just one last question. If you could say one thing to widowed parents of teenage girls, what would you say?
Take good care of yourself. I would say that, that I remember actually in my first, I knew all of my life I wanted to be a psychologist. Starting at age 7, I knew I wanted to be a psychologist. So not all my life, but most of my life. And so I remember going to college and signing up right away for psychology classes. And I remember the first day in child development, which was in my first semester of freshman year, the instructor, who was a really well-established and known psychologist, he said, it's very hard for kids to do better than their parents are doing. And that obviously stayed with me. So I would say, shore yourself up. Take good care of yourself. Surround yourself with supports. The way we think about stress is that it's transactional, that if something really, really bad or awful happens, you need a ton of support to counterbalance that, right? That bad things happen, then you up the supports as much as you can. And there's lots of ways to think about support. So it's thinking about what kind of supports are you needing. That the greatest gift we can give our teenagers, if we can, is to be really boring and self-sufficient as parents. To to allow them to be the ones whose lives feel a little unsteady and unpredictable and drama-filled, that's sort of what it means to be a teenager. And so if we can surround them with a pretty stable and boring environment where we're meeting our needs, in lots of ways that don't necessarily depend on them, I think that's a huge gift. Which is not to say that you can't look to your child for support or look to your teenager for support, or, especially when you're sharing something that no one else shares with you. But it is to say that I think the best gift any parent can give their teenager, under any conditions, is that the parent's in pretty good shape, and the teenager can then know that and feel safe exploring the world away from the parent.
Okay, well, I think that's a great place to end. My guest today is Dr. Lisa Damour, who's a clinical psychologist and the executive director of the Laurel School Center for Research on Girls, and is the author of Untangled and Under Pressure, just released this week, available on Amazon and wherever you buy books. So, Lisa, where can listeners find you if they'd like to learn more about your work?
So my website is Dr. Lisa Damour, so it's DrLisadAmour.com, and that's got all my stuff on it. It's got my columns for the Times and my any press I do, and then information about my books.
Okay, great. And I saw some really great videos on different pieces of your book. Yep. I'll put a link to those and everything, too.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Dr. Lisa Damour as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 13. And hey, I have some exciting news. I'm going to do an upcoming episode called Homeowner 101. My widowed friend texted me the other day saying that her pipe had broken, and she'd been running around like a chicken with her head cut off trying to deal with it. She said we needed a widow checklist for house stuff. Brilliant. It happens that this is right up my alley. I really love this stuff. So I've lined up a contractor to answer all our questions about home maintenance and repair. I need your help to determine what questions to ask him. Head on over to widowedparentpodcast.com, where you'll find a link to the Homeowner 101 survey. Tell me what questions and challenges you're facing so that I can make sure we address them. And I really want to stress that this is absolutely not a gendered thing. Many dads are accomplished in the kitchen, and many moms wield power tools, myself included. So anyone who needs to catch up on how you care for your home or yard or car, you're in the right place. And hey, if you're already comfortable with these skills, that's fantastic. Have you taught your kids yet? If not, you'll want to be on the lookout for the information I'm putting together so you can help them learn some adulting skills. They're going to need to know sooner or later anyway. Remember, if you're finding this podcast interesting, please subscribe and rate and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. Until next week, keep smiling.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.